I wish I could take 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and sit them in my office, because you've heard it, Scott. 40-year-olds will come into the office early and say, man, I wish I knew this in my 20s. And I also think that young women really get the shaft, in terms of, there's so many young women that come to me in their 40s who've never had a cholesterol panel drawn, never. So I think we have to, help our primary care doctors, help the nurse practitioners, help the physician assistants, the OBGYN, the urologist. And, my father's a urologist, and he always says that the urologist really needs to take the charge as a men's health doctor. So
welcome to Longevity Advantage. I'm your host, Scott Fulton. Today we have another special guest, a friend and cardiologist in the name of Vinay Hosmane. Dr. Hosmane has a practice in Newark, Delaware, and another one as well he can talk about, but he's also medical director for the Ornish Intensive Cardiac Rehabilitation facility in Newark, Delaware. Welcome, Vinay.
thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. I love talking with you, so I'm looking forward to this afternoon.
Yeah, the design of this was no accident. We come from very similar viewpoints on this, and so we thought, rather than just the two of us talking to each other, why don't we share this and tape our conversation? So maybe before we jump into it, maybe you can give us a bit of a background. The medical roots run deep in your family.
That's correct, Scott. I'm fortunate to be a third generation physician. My grandfather was a general practitioner back in India. And before he passed, I remember doing rounds with him when I must be 5 or 6 years old, kind of like the traditional village country doctor. And my father's a urologist who still practices. He's in his 80s in Lewis, Delaware. So I get to share a lot of patients with him. And when you asked the question about the family of physicians, I calculated my dad has 5 cousins and an uncle who are all physicians. 2 of them are physicians here in this country. And then my cousin is also a physician. And as I was kind of reflecting on that, I think things come full circle, because when my grandfather went to medical school in India, he was fast-tracked through medical school by the British, kind of like a British health service. And part of their training was Ayurvedic medicine, and part of their training was Western medicine. And so, and my dad actually has another cousin I forgot to mention, who's actually an Ayurvedic doctor. And my cousin actually did the same thing many years later, where he did traditional Western medical school with Ayurvedic training. And I know you and I have talked a lot about supplements and things like that. And I feel that some of the supplements we're using now are really founded out of Ayurvedic medicine. So you making me reflect on my family history has kind of brought that full circle. I think the Ayurvedic medicine does have its place in Western medicine as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you raise that up, because I think a lot of people, maybe you just talk a little bit about what Ayurvedic medicine is, but the fact that it's medicine. I think that's probably a fact most people don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my viewpoint of Ayurvedic medicine is a little bit biased, given that I'm a Western medicine doctor. Sometimes we do a little bit too much better living through chemistry. But the way I summarize Ayurvedic medicine, not using the pure definition, but I would say it's basically thousands of years of medicine, how it was practiced before we had all these modern CAT scans and X-rays, and before we had modern pharmaceutical companies. What did people do thousands of years ago when they had a problem? I remember being a kid in India, having a scrape. You bleed a little bit, they wash it out with soap and water, and then they rub turmeric paste in it, and they tie it with a clean cloth bandage, and it's amazing. I didn't think anything of it. Cool, my finger's orange. But you talk to my parents, they said, yeah, we didn't have betadine or bacitracin. We used the anti-inflammatory effects of turmeric, and was also antibacterial. So basically, it's taking ancient herbs and spices, and making and realizing the medicinal property of it. And also at the same time, there's a lot of things that they learned about how these different herbs and spices and lifestyle affected your body in a positive way. We talk about stevia, and my mom does the books for my cardiology practice and overhears me talking about stevia, and she goes, "Oh, that's a diabetic plant." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "Yeah, I don't know the actual species name, but that's the diabetic plant." And she draws it and says, "This is what it looks like." And we used to use that all the time when the diabetic relatives came over and you needed to sweeten their coffee. You'd sweeten it with this plant because we knew it wouldn't increase the sugar like refined sugar. So there's a lot of interesting things like that. And I start talking to the chef at the restaurant that I'm co-owner of, and Chef Gigi down at Ross and Lewis always starts talking about different vegetables and how the shape of different vegetables fit the shape of the organ. Like he always tells me, "Vinay, sweet potato is good for the pancreas. It's shaped like a pancreas. And you really should be eating a sweet potato than a white potato." So there's a lot of things that have been kind of handed down. And so I like to think that the modern supplement industry and what some of us preach and what Scott and you talk about with diet and food as medicine is really founded out of Ayurvedic medicine.
Yeah, it's not a new thing at all. It's really, modern medicine is built on a lot of that foundational information. We've just found new options and new applications and new ways to make money, if you're in the pharmaceutical business,
Right.
but it isn't necessarily the only way, is it?
Right. Also convenience, right? Because if you package a supplement, it's a little bit less grocery shopping you have to do. I know if your friend Joel Kahn, I follow Dr. Kahn very frequently, and Dr. Kahn always says, is it 6 to 8 servings of vegetables? So he does a lot of smoothies in the morning with all those greens. Now people are selling the breakfast greens powder because it's convenient, where Dr. Kahn, preaches, go get your greens and make your smoothie in the morning. And that's why a lot of older cardiologists will say, you don't need to eat the supplements, just eat properly.
Right. Yeah, it's not that hard. The hardest part is just getting used to having it available. Once it's available, it's no more work than reaching for a supplement by the time you go get that out in a lot of cases. And of course, you're getting the benefit of eating, or the enjoyment of eating a food. There's no enjoyment in taking a supplement, right?
No.
It's an expectation you're going to have some enjoyment later,
Right.
but food, you get the instant gratification.
It's just checking the box. I remember early in my career, I had a little issue with some high, low HDL, high triglycerides. So I cut the carbs, and my family doctor, who's also from India, had the same problem, and he wanted to start me on niacin, and I didn't want to deal with the flushing that my father had. So I said, "Hey, why don't we just drink some red wine?" So every day I used to come home and drink, Thomas Hardy wine that came in a box. That's a good quality wine in a box. And every you take a couple of hits of the wine, and after about a month and a half, I'm like, I'm not even enjoying this. I'm just checking the box. And I go back and check with my doctor and found out he had given it up too, because there was no enjoyment just coming and taking that wine without having a conversation,
Right.
without savoring it, without sharing it with somebody. It was just to check the box, and it's not enjoyable when you check the box.
Yeah, just on that point, it's one I talk about in class often. People ask about red wine, is it good or bad? And you can find data on either side. And I say, there's not enough data to have a compelling argument one way or the other, but I'll tell you, if you're drinking wine in fellowship and community, that's where the benefit's coming from, more than whether the resveratrol is at a level or quantity
Correct.
sufficient for benefit.
I would agree with that. I mean, if you look at the long meals and the family aspect of what they do in Europe, the large family meals in France and Italy, Greece, and Dr. Ornish also preaches that too, right? In order to be heart healthy or fight disease, you had to have a good interpersonal relationship with your fellow man, whether it's your spouse or your kid or your neighbor. That type of relationship is important.
Yeah. But both emotionally and in terms of lower cortisol levels, but also the functional benefits of having that support network around you too. So it's always good, I think, to kind of set the stage around. People think they know what a cardiologist does, but maybe you can kind of give us the real sense of, kind of what are your top things you do in terms of on the intervention side? I
Sure.
know we're going to spend more on the other, but just from the if you don't want to listen to anything else, you better listen to this part.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first, just to summarize, cardiologists can wear many hats. We have non-interventional cardiologists, which are cardiologists like myself, who don't do any surgeries or any surgical procedures, no blood and guts. We have electrophysiologists who deal with the electrical system of the heart, put in pacemakers and defibrillators. And then we have interventional cardiologists that actually put in stents and do angiograms and open up blocked arteries. I think common to all the cardiologists, especially here in Delaware, most super specialized cardiologists like electrical doctors or heart catheterization doctors will also encroach on my turf in a good way because they'll take care of general cardiology patients. So a cardiologist basically takes care of the entire cardiovascular system, trying to keep the blood vessels healthy, looking at heart valves, looking at blood pressure, looking at hyperlipidemia, and in essence, trying to prevent heart attack and stroke. We also try to diagnose heart arrhythmias, to sort out why somebody has chest pain, why do they have dizziness, why do they have shortness of breath, why do they have leg edema. So some of the common diagnoses that I deal with are heart valve disease, coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure, atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia. Deal a lot with cholesterol disturbances. We are unfortunately or fortunately having to encroach on diabetes a little bit, try to help people with nutrition and weight management. But what's happening with cardiology, cardiology is also going more towards prevention. So I've on my own and just like you have, Scott, kind of gravitated towards prevention and have become very self-taught in prevention. I was fortunate that my mentor had just retired. Many of the viewers may know Edward Goldenberg. He was a cardiologist at Christiana for many years. And Ed was one of my main mentors and taught me a lot of preventive cardiology. So I've gravitated more towards preventive cardiology, but unfortunately or fortunately, a bulk of my practice is still dealing with valve disease, coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure, electrical disturbances. And unfortunately, it's I say fortunately because I enjoy it, but unfortunately because it's all secondary prevention at that point. So that's why I try to gravitate my practice a little bit towards primary prevention, and that's come all self-taught by trying to attend courses or lectures at the organization you belong to, American College of Lifestyle Medicine, following Dr. Joel Kahn, Caldwell Esselstyn, Michael Roizen, and trying to go to the Harvard School of Public Health, Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives courses. So if you find a cardiologist who's big into preventive cardiology, a lot of that is probably self-taught after cardiology training. And I guess I'll finish the last question before my attention span goes away. What's you asked what's very important to know. I think number one, my take homes are, as you and I always talk about, know your numbers. To prevent cardiovascular disease, you have to know your body mass index, what's your waist, what's your LDL cholesterol number, what's your fasting blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C, the measure of your glucose control. You have to know what your blood pressure is. And I also throw in, you have to know how many steps a day you take, because the more steps a day that you walk and you take, the healthier you are. And I also, and going back on, knowing your numbers, when you talk about LDL cholesterol, we don't want to get too deep into this, but a lot of people say, oh, my cholesterol is good. Well, yes, your cholesterol could be good, but if you have low HDL or you have high triglycerides, people will tell you your cholesterol is good, even though the total cholesterol and the LDL are good, but there's different shades of LDL cholesterol. So especially if you have a family history of early heart disease, my cholesterol looked good when I first looked at it, but if you break it down, you realize I have a stickier form of cholesterol. So asking more questions about your cholesterol is very important. Also, I feel that if you have a family history of coronary disease or stickier cholesterol, things like a coronary artery calcium score, which is an X-ray CAT scan picture of your heart without dye, seeing if you've made some subclinical coronary atherosclerosis, that's becoming more favorable. And that test has been around since the 1980s. And another test I think people should be aware of is carotid integral medial thickness, where you look at the subclinical plaque deposition in the artery wall. but I think those are important tests that look for looking for plaque, because a lot of us don't know we have plaque. Um, and we know from, soldiers in Vietnam who unfortunately expired and had autopsies that 18, 19, 20-year-old, men had coronary atherosclerosis. But we certainly do see people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who don't have any atherosclerosis. So we know that's possible. And I think that's the biggest take home is even before you get to the cardiologist, ask your primary care doctor that question. And I think the last thing about that's very important to know for men is whether you have erectile dysfunction or not. And erectile dysfunction is actually mainly a vascular disease, and we won't go into the whole differential diagnosis of prostate cancer, prostate therapy, trauma, surgery, hormonal disorders can all cause it, but frequently erectile dysfunction is a cardiovascular disease, and it precedes coronary disease by 5 years. So when I educate men who are 40, 50s, and I say, if any of your friends say, hey, I'm having erectile difficulty, the first thing you should probably say is maybe see a cardiologist and a urologist simultaneously, because that's a great way to make an intervention. And that's a point that there's not a know your number for that, but that's something that I do throw in. And I know Dr. Khan, our friend, has written a book pertaining to that as well.
Yeah, it's the canary in the mine, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, you touched on a whole bunch of stuff there, so
Yes.
let me circle back and
Yes.
get on a few of them. So you talked a little bit about sticky LDL, so I think that's a good one where I kind of want to take people deeper than HDL's good, LDL's bad. There's more to it than that, right? Your body produces both for a reason.
Correct.
But particularly on the LDL side, they're not all LDL numbers are the same, and just because you have whatever your number is, it's still made up of fractions of different types of LDL.
Correct.
So one of them in particular we know is genetic, and I think that's the one when you talk about getting your numbers checked. I put that one on my list of I'd like to find that one out when I'm 20, not wait until later, because it'll definitely influence my choices.
Right. And when I talk about LDL, I try to do the simplified version. So the way I put it is, and it's a little bit simplified, and I know you're very technical, so please don't flag me on it. But what I like to say is that if somebody has LDL that's 70, well, that's great LDL numbers, right? You like your LDL in a generally healthy person below 130, preferably below 100. And if you have some coronary disease, hypertension, diabetes, you want it below 70. So if you have 70 milligrams of LDL per deciliter of blood, let's say, Scott, you and I can both have 70 LDL, and everybody's like, oh, that's great. But I'll use myself as an example. What does Vinay have? Vinay has 70 LDL, but we did his carotid test or we did his CAT scan. He doesn't have hypertension or diabetes. He's relatively normal weight. But why does Vinay have atherosclerosis and Scott doesn't? And people used to be perplexed of why that is. And basically, if you take an LDL molecule through mass spectroscopy, like they do in the chemistry lab, NMR imaging, they found out that the LDLs are composed differently. So the way I talk about it is, we could both have 70 LDL. My 70 LDL has more particles within it, and yours doesn't. So mine that has more particles is more atherogenic. And the one way I teach my patients is, well, what does that mean? It means it can actually stick or enter the arterial wall much more easier. So there's large buoyant particles and small dense LDL particles. And sometimes people use something called ApoB, which actually makes up the LDL. ApoB particle makes up LDL, VLDL, and it's a marker of atherogenic particles. I think that's what you're alluding to. And sometimes there's something called lipoprotein A that's also within an LDL that makes it much stickier. And those things, a lot of primary care doctors unfortunately don't know about. And I think a lot of primary care doctors who do know about it, learned it out of self-interest, and some of them because the patients brought it to them. And I think unfortunately the healthcare system's overloaded. So a lot of times you go to the doctor's office, they check the cholesterol. Scott, your cholesterol looks good. Vinay, yours look good. But meanwhile, mine is doing more harm. And I think the one way that I try to convince people there are different measures of LDL is you hear all the time, George had normal cholesterol, but he still had a heart attack. Or George had a heart attack and they dropped his cholesterol really, really low, but George had another stent. Why did that happen? Because there's residual risk. And we used to use the term residual risk when we drop somebody's cholesterol after a cardiovascular event, but they're still having events. And I think this is what probably led the researchers to go and look at these LDLs and know that all LDL is not made the same. All HDL is not made the same. And some people in the past, we used to say, oh, you have high HDL, you're protected. But then why do people with high HDL still have cardiovascular events? And we're starting to learn that there's different sizes and characters, and some HDL is more protective than others, just like some LDL is more atherogenic than others. And you have to keep in mind, we need LDL. So a lot of people get worried that low LDL might cause dementia, low LDL may cause me not to function. And I think you and I both try to remind people that toddlers have LDLs in the 20s and 30s, and they still make neurons and neurotransmitters, and they function. So I think the take home is not all LDL is the same. If you have a family history of heart disease, or you have coronary plaquing or plaquing anywhere that you shouldn't have, please ask for an advanced lipid profile. That's often the easiest thing to ask for.
Yeah, I look at some of those and say, if I were to get some tests in my 20s, perhaps, because I'm certainly one of the ones I would say whatever damage I did was in my 20s and 30s. It's fine to say in later life, I'll deal with it, but of course, the consequences of dealing with it later are a little bit like in a long run, right? You're into the marathon and you're into the last 5 miles. Well, if you went too hard on the first 20, right, those last 5 are now going to be suffering, and you may not make it to the finish, or you'll be doing some walking versus saying, well, I'd like to know early if am I on pace or not. And it's take one marker, one checkpoint, and say, particularly if it's a genetic test, to say, is this something, if you told someone they were predisposed to cancer and everyone should do this one test, we would all be lining up to get that one test to know that, okay, I need to stay away from this, or I need to make sure I do that. We don't seem to do that with any of the cardiovascular diseases, which I think is part of why we're in trouble, and partly why you and I take such an approach of this. There's so much more you and I as individuals can do now that we didn't have access to a number of years ago, and we didn't understand it as well either.
And I think part of the problem, I echo your sentiments, Scott, and I think it was very well put, what you just said. I think part of the problem, as you know, is it's not paid for by insurance companies don't pay for screening. And I probably maybe excommunicated, but I will say that there's United Service. I went to public health school, and I do respect the United Preventive Services Task Force, but they look at things in terms of, if you do population screening or screening tests for a population and it costs X amount of dollars, how much are you going to save in the long run? And to me, in cardiology, if you save one life, you prevent one heart attack, we prevent one COVID death by getting a COVID vaccine. I think that's enough. And so, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has, gotten rid of some testing like carotid into a medial thickness testing, PSA testing, and prostate cancer. A lot of these tests cost money, and you have to use them with a grain of salt. But unfortunately, the insurers for some reason do not want to pay for preventive screening. And we can go into a whole sidebar about why that is. But if you're the financial guy, or you would think that you would say, let's prevent all this disease and pay for it up front, so we don't pay for chronic diseases. But that's clearly not happening. And some of these tests are expensive, but I do find that if you do have high cholesterol or family history, and I think you would agree, a lot of these tests like ApoB or lipoprotein A levels are in fact getting paid for. But the coronary artery calcium score, the carotid test, they don't want to pay for it. And so all these are out-of-pocket tests. And I think while we're on that topic, I do know that Delaware Diagnostic Imaging on Limestone and Kirkwood Highway here in Wilmington, Delaware, I negotiated a price of $95 for a coronary artery calcium score. and a carotid into a medial thickness test, I think in our office is 150. If you go to some of the university centers, it's 250. That's a small price to pay, for a window inside. One, you look at the arterial health, have I made plaque? And then number two, you're looking at, am I going to make plaque? And I think we need to get the test out there, and I think the biggest thing is just awareness. And if you and I could take back things that we did in our 20s, we would do it. We would give up that pizza, we give up that beer. $5 large pizza at Domino's when I was at University of Delaware in the 1990s. My roommate reminded me that he's still eating the whole large pizza by himself, and that's why he's in trouble. Because we'd split a large pizza by ourselves. And I think young people feel that they're invincible. And unfortunately, there's a tipping point, I call it the wrong side of 40, where you start realizing you're not that quite invincible. And 40, I think for men is a good number. And maybe we should use that, Scott. And, I'd love to get the 20-year-olds in here. I think you're dead on, but I think once you turn 40, it may not be too late, and that's where we we try to get some forward thinking men, at least in their 40s. The women come to us earlier, but there's got to be some type of campaign, at least with family history, by doing these tests in the 20s.
Yeah, particularly with the coronary artery calcium scan, that is so inexpensive. It takes literally minutes. If you go in to get one done and you're not out of there in a half an hour for $99, something's really off, because that's really all it is. It's not 5 minutes on the table. It's one of the easiest tests to do. I know Joel Kahn, that's one of the ones he loves. He's done thousands of them. And it just gives you an indication of how susceptible you are, and finding that kind of information out the early. I would suggest that one, like, had I known that test was around at 40, that should be an automatic.
Exactly.
I'll use another example of how many people get sent in for a colonoscopy versus how many die from colon cancer.
Yes.
Put that against how many people get a calcium scan that die from coronary artery disease. Right?
Yeah. It's a discrepancy.
The cost, the inconvenience of getting a colonoscopy, right? You think that's, this is nothing like that.
Yes.
This is literally, you could go on your coffee break from work, you'll spend more time driving there and getting back. So it's one of those, like, you got to come up with a lot better excuse, not a radiation thing. You'll get more radiation flying to your holiday destination,
Correct.
let alone a return trip.
Right. Another thing I teach, Scott, is my staff. I've taught it to my staff, my medical students that come in, the cardiology fellows, and the medical students and medical residents. It's interesting. We do a lot of CAT scans for lung cancer screening. So my staff knows that if somebody comes in and they've had any CAT scan of the chest, they've had any MRI of the head and neck or CAT scan of the head and neck, they've had any abdominal X-ray, bring it to me. Because oftentimes atherosclerosis is actually reported in there. You'd be surprised how many people have a chest X-ray and they have atherosclerosis in the aortic knob, which is where the aorta comes off the heart and turns to go down to the bottom part of the body. If you see a calcification or atherosclerosis in there, that's not in everybody. It used to be, it's a given, it's age, it's senile atherosclerosis, it's okay. It's not okay. And I had a dentist, Ryan Robinson, of Pain and Sleep Therapy of Delaware. He does a lot of head and neck pain and airway and breathing, which I think is a whole nother good topic. We should have him talk about breathing and how that affects us. But he sends me patients routinely where he's examining their airway for sleep apnea, and he's sending me CAT scan pictures of carotid atherosclerosis in a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old. And those are all incidental findings. And it's a shame that a lot of these incidental findings are missed. And patients say, I never knew that. Nobody told me that. And we had a lady the other day who had an abdominal X-ray for some abdominal pain. And she had abdominal atherosclerosis, never knew it. And we picked up that X-ray from 8 years ago. So if you have atherosclerosis in your carotid artery, you have it in the knob of your aorta, and you have it in your abdominal aorta, it's a good bet you have it in your coronary arteries, because the coronary arteries are much smaller. in diameter. So usually atherosclerosis is an equal opportunity employer. Occasionally it'll just preference one artery or another if there's some, something genetically wrong with that artery or there's a kink in it. But I think that's another tidbit. If you've had a CAT scan, you've had an abdominal X-ray, or an MRI of the head and neck, ask your primary care doctor, could you pull that? Do I have any atherosclerosis there? And if you have atherosclerosis, you don't necessarily need a coronary calcium score because you've already declared yourself at increased risk.
Yeah, so I think you touched on another one I wanted to go back to as well, was the whole connection between heart disease, stroke, diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia. Traditionally in the public, we think of these all as separate because they have, they may have separate specialists that they go to. Can you just talk about that for a minute?
I mean, the way I think about it is that, we know hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia is a risk factor for heart attacks. It's a risk factor for stroke. But the way I took your question is what comes to mind is, how do we prevent dementia? And there was a great news article by Sanjay Gupta, who's the neurosurgeon in CNN. And one of the things that he was talking about is how do you prevent dementia? And the one thing he said is that as we age, please seek out new activities to build new neurons and build new synapses and learning new experiences, not going through the rut of doing the same thing and forcing your brain and straining your brain to learn something, hopefully not under pressure because you're still working, but you're retired and you have time, helps. But the one thing that he said is the same thing that we do for heart health is the same, and for brain health to prevent stroke is the same thing that we should do to prevent dementia. And I thought that was pretty profound. So the same risk factors for regular senile dementia is hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, smoking, bad diet, lack of exercise. And he basically, as a seasoned neurosurgeon, has told us that that's what we need to do. In terms of the Alzheimer's connection, I'm not as well versed in that. My take home from that, I think it's more genetic. I'm not sure how much we can prevent. I mean, there is some literature out there, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, with plant-based diet and decreasing inflammation, and maybe that will help. I'm not well versed enough to know, what more can we do to prevent Alzheimer's other than keeping people in a routine, and enhancing their brain health by targeting these risk factors and preventing them early.
I think in my analysis of it, it comes back to, I think what you were really getting to, it's almost one solution addresses several risks. Alzheimer's falls into there as right. One of the categories of dementia. And the more we understand it, it's falling more in that direction. It's more complex. It's not to say if you eat plant-based, you will never get Alzheimer's. But by the same token, the healthier lifestyle that you live, the lower your odds will be of dementia. That I don't think anyone is disputing. So
correct. Okay.
Yeah.
And going back to, we just touched upon the plant-based diet, which is difficult for a lot of people. And I think if you and you do a much better job because you're following it. But if someone like me who's working and we're pulled in multiple different directions, I joke if I had a personal chef, I think the next person we hire on staff at Hosmane Cardiology has to have some culinary training, because if you prep my meals for me, I'm going to eat plant-based 100% of the time. But I recently attended a Harvard School of Public Health course with the Culinary Institute of America, and one of the things that they gave all the data on plant-based diet, and they made a comment for people who are very busy, who are not so sure they can give up their meat completely. They actually were saying 50% of your plate fruits and vegetables, shrink the size of your meat and increase your fruits and vegetables and make it 50% of your plate. And one of the speakers, everybody's probably rolling their eyes, we're all virtual, but one of the speakers, showed us what he had for breakfast. He had a 3-egg omelet, and he is a Mexican omelet, and he had his beans and a little bit of cheese in there and his salsa. And half his plate, 3/4 of his plate was roasted vegetables that he had roasted while he was making his omelet. And that's something we've been preaching with patients. I believe in plant-based and try to really push the plant-based, but for some people, they can't do it. They don't have the prep time. They grew up with the meat, and you really try to get them to leaner meats. But I'll tell you, people who are going to 50% of their plate fruits and vegetables, their LDL comes down, their sugars come down, they feel better, and they become believers. They're not all going plant-based, but they're believers to at least, as I say, meet it halfway.
Yeah, to me, it's one of those, once they've done it for long enough and made some difference, particularly the worse off you are, the more opportunity there is to gain and to see the difference. And how far they go with it is really, it's all going to be a personal choice. It's not like anyone's typically going to tell them, short of a patient who's just had or is going to have a choice between quadruple bypass within the next month, to say, well, I'll give you 4 weeks to change and see if you can change your numbers that fast, if one wanted to do that. But yeah, it's it's the same, I think, with any of these things. We talk about them. There's an age factor with all of these things, right? They all have a time component. We're all at some different rise rate on it. We'll all get cardiovascular disease of some sort if we live long enough, and that might be 300 years, right? If we don't get hit by something else. But yeah, it's generally around, how do you get yourself onto a trajectory to know that you should be able to remain healthy. And I look at it from the longevity standpoint, is you don't want to spend, you finally have worked your career and done a lot of things along the way, to suddenly find yourself, your retirement is consumed with medical appointments and the compounding of chronic diseases. And that's, I think, of changes we've seen over the last 50 years. And to kind of sum it up, don't worry about what it is. I would say cardiovascular disease, clearly it's the big mound in the middle of all that. Yeah. But that's where a lot of people have got to, unfortunately, and you can reverse it. But so for you, both sides, prevention or reversal, which is easier?
Well, I would say, from the monetary standpoint, reversal. Trying to reverse it and halt it is easier because the insurances pay for it, and they're working against us. The insurance companies work against us for reversal. I mean, for prevention. But I think that what I like about prevention is prevention of cardiovascular disease doesn't just prevent cardiovascular disease, right? Me preaching prevention of cardiovascular disease, you preaching prevention of cardiovascular disease makes a lot of things better, right? If I say, Scott, you got to go exercise and go run for your heart and do some walking, and you got to get some weight off to get your pre-diabetes down and cut the fats in your diet. Well, you're not going to die trying to do that. You're actually going to decrease your cardiovascular risk, but then people come back and say, oh, my knees feel better, my back feels better, right? I mean, and lifestyle medicine, should be prescribed for all of us. And the more and more I do this, I'm just like, you get to the point where you're like, what am I doing secondary prevention? And there's not many people like Dr. Joel Kahn, who, I asked him on the phone once, I said, how did you just go from being a secondary prevention guy one day in 180 degrees to primary prevention? I mean, how do you make that leap? And it's a tough leap, because now you don't have your source of income, which is insurance companies. So yeah, primary, from the facetious standpoint, secondary prevention is way easier for me. It's a path of least resistance. And I'll give you an example. Someone like you comes to me and says, I want to talk to you about cardiovascular prevention. I don't even have a billing code. Scott doesn't have hypertension. He doesn't have a diabetes, doesn't have sleep apnea. He's not obese. I have nothing to bill. We had to, and so it's hard. How do I get paid? Because my practice is set up to be paid by insurance. And that's where I really like some of our colleagues and who do integrative medicine. And some people think they're hokey, but they're able to get so much done in the preventive world. And the doctors that you work with in the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, because that prevention doesn't get paid for, and people will, and unfortunately you have to pay to play, right? You have to pay cash to get these things done, to get the knowledge. But, my accountant keeps telling me, Vinay, you need to put some money away in your health savings account. Right. I'm like, I'm trying to spend money on like tennis lessons with a coach that runs me around and paying more for plant-based foods, and paying my staff to go get me healthy food, then put money in my health savings account. Right. I mean, I'm trying to pay it up front. And so I always joke with my accountant, like, yes, I know I need to put in my health savings account, but I need to put money down now towards prevention, because unfortunately we follow people chronically for years, and the most heartbreaking thing is seeing somebody ready to retire and have a cardiovascular event, or not be able to keep up with the grandkids, or not be able to, they don't want to fly overseas because they're scared of their health, or they can't go to Disney with their grandkids because they can't walk the park. So I know one part of me is like, lifestyle medicine is the answer for everything. But at the same time, the Western doctor in me does truly believe in the statins and the beta blockers and the blood pressure medications. But I do try to get every one of my patients to try to decrease their reliance on medications.
Sure. Yeah, it's I think the one I look to is money truly a barrier? And if it's not, like for getting some of the screening tests done, yeah, it'd be great if insurance covered it. Certainly we would get more people there, but I would tell you there's a lot of people who that is not the barrier.
Right.
So for those people,
some of it's education. I mean, $95 in most of my patients who I asked to get a coronary calcium score, 99.9% will save the money and get it. If money is tight. And now, and then the one thing I want to bring up about the coronary calcium score, and I know you and I have talked about it in the past, a lot of, what is coronary calcification, right? Atherosclerosis and cholesterol deposits on a blood vessel wall. And it's a process, right? It's an atherosclerotic process. And the simplified way is somebody has excess cholesterol. They have sticky cholesterol. Cholesterol is needed as chemical messengers and hormones, and makes up cell membranes in the body. But if you have excess, it's got to go somewhere, and it floats around the bloodstream in the simplified version, not exactly the full truth. And if you have an irritated arterial wall, it's more likely to stick. Your artery wall is irritated by a fatty diet. It's irritated by nicotine. It's irritated by high blood pressure. It's irritated by stress. It's genetically irritated. Maybe some people have stiffened arteries. And then that cholesterol sticks and it stays there. And sometimes with time, if the cholesterol plaque has been there for a while, it becomes calcified. And if it becomes calcified, that's essentially old plaque, and generally calcified plaque is more stable plaque. We worry about soft plaque when it's made, because that's the one that can rupture, and the body thinks the artery wall is rupturing. So then there's a platelet and thrombin rave party, and you have an acute clot. But and with coronary calcium scores, you don't see the soft plaque, you see the hard plaque that's been there for a while. So if you take a statin medication, or you've had atherosclerotic plaque, and then you find yourself getting into a better diet, exercise, you can kind of shrink that plaque and heal it, make it stable. So a statin medication can do it, but diet and lifestyle can do it. The calcified plaque goes higher than the soft plaque. That can falsely elevate your coronary calcium score. So especially in people who have made dramatic lifestyle changes, weight loss, they may have a coronary calcium score of 0, and then they go through great lifestyle changes, or they have a statin, then their calcium score becomes 400. And now we're really, really worried. But sometimes the coronary calcium score may just be the natural healing process. So if somebody's been on a statin for a long time, I'm not an advocate of ordering a coronary calcium score, because if you've committed to a statin already, you've already committed to trying to decrease your cardiovascular risk. So you've already taken that step. The next step you need to take is a lifestyle factor. If somebody has a coronary calcium score, and we decide we're going to treat them aggressively, lifestyle changes, blood pressure medicines, cholesterol medicines, I don't often recheck a calcium score, because inevitably it's going to be higher, and then it leads to frustration. So there's a guy, Alan Taylor, who's one of the cardiologists who really pushed coronary calcium scoring. And it was obviously Dr. Agatston, who did the South Beach side, who came up with the test. But Dr. Alan Taylor, when I was a cardiology fellow in training, I interviewed for a job at Christiana when he was leaving the U.S. military. And so we asked him that question. We were asked him all kinds of questions. And he told me, Vinay, don't reorder a coronary calcium score. It's not going to be of use in somebody you've already committed to a statin. You could use it if you've committed to somebody in a statin that's very low dose and is reticent to take more and reticent to do more lifestyle because their cholesterol looks good. You could get it in there because sometimes visualization is good reinforcement.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the tools, right? It's not the answer to everything. It's one indicator that you can start to at least triangulate around what may be going on at a certain point in time, and it may be if that's why I kind of look at it. If we all got one earlier,
Agreed.
we may never
Agreed.
need to get another one, or 25 years later. This idea of waiting to me is almost you've missed the opportunity.
Yeah. I mean,
to learn.
our congressional leaders in government were kind enough to give, business payroll protection loans during the pandemic. They were kind enough to give people stimulus checks. I mean, I guess maybe it's not kind, it's our money, however you look at it. We can save that political discussion for later, but $95, we negotiated a $95 price of Delaware Diagnostic Imaging. They make no money on that test. If our government gave us that, they deducted $95 from my first Social Security check. That would be huge, right? I mean, and so I think it's a great message for today. I think especially for people who have a family history of early coronary disease, if you have prediabetes, hyperlipidemia, prehypertension at a young age, I think it's a no-brainer to get that done.
Yeah, and I think if I kind of step back and say if there's a message here, which you said at the start, it's know your numbers, right? Yeah. So I'll put at the end of this as well, kind of that list of numbers for people to start to look at. And I've got actually a dashboard I'm going to put up on one of my websites so people can download it from there too. And it really that to me is what sets you free, right? People have this, well, if I know, then I'm going to have to do something. Well, if you know, then at least whatever you're doing will work to set you freer than what you are, and not to. I give the analogy of in today's medicine, with all the data that we can learn, particularly around cardiovascular risk, it's a little like the Titanic. Say, but with all the sensors and broad daylight and calm seas, and you still run into the iceberg. Like, don't be that guy or gal.
Well, I mean, it's a travesty, right? Because you and I were talking data before, and I think it was 655,000 people die a year of heart disease, as 1 in 4 deaths are due to heart disease. And with, like you said, with all the stuff that we have now with statins and knowledge of different drugs and the cardiac rehab programs and what exercise works and what diet works and phenomenal dietitians, for this to happen in a Western country is a complete tragedy, as was COVID-19. And you start to wonder, like, we got to get our shit together in this country. First cardiovascular disease, and then we had a problem with COVID. And I wish I could take 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and sit them in my office, because you've heard it, Scott. 40-year-olds will come into the office early and say, man, I wish I knew this in my 20s. And it's usually men in their 40s will all of a sudden say, I'm 40, I got some kids, I got to come in. And that seems to be the magic genetic age, or something turns in their head. And then you have men in their 60s who are trying to figure out if they can retire. And they're like, man, doc, if I just, knew this in my 40s. And the interesting thing is the guys who are in their 40s and 60s who come to us are often the motivated people who are exercising. Okay. And they just wish they tweaked it up enough. They wish they were on that statin. They wish they had decreased their meat a little bit. They wish they didn't smoke the cigars or the cigarettes. They wish they didn't drink a 6-pack of beer a couple weekends a month. So I kind of wish that we could get 20 and 40-year-olds in here to listen to these guys. And your analogy of, you're 50 and you get a colonoscopy. why can't you be 20 or 30 or 40 and know your numbers? And I also think that young women really get the shaft in terms of, there's so many young women that come to me in their 40s who've never had a cholesterol panel drawn, never, right? And we know that women will catch up to men with equivalent cardiovascular disease when they get into their 60s, when they're postmenopausal. But we do still certainly more and more see women in their 40s and 50s have coronary events, and some of them have never had a lipid drawn, which with family history. And so and unfortunately those patients don't all come to me. They don't come across you in your lectures. So I think we have to help our primary care doctors, help the nurse practitioners, help the physician assistants, the OBGYN, the urologist. And my father's a urologist, and he always says that the urologist really needs to take the charge as a men's health doctor. So 20 years ago, my father was teaching me as a urologist. I was rotating with him when I was in medical school, check their blood pressure, order their cholesterol if they don't have one. It's not just their PSA. And my father still to this day will order lipid panels in men who have not had them recently, and then get them with a primary care doctor. He checks blood pressures, but not all the urologists do that because they're busy, and we don't have enough. I don't think we have enough healthcare providers in this country.
Yeah, and that's partly where I try to go as well on the public side is all you have to do is ask for this stuff. Right? It's going to be very hard for your primary care physician to deny that request. Most of them are trained that you're not that interested anyway, so you're going to view it as an inconvenience. They're going to have to spend time to convince you why it's important, versus spin it around and say, I think I'm due, or I've never had this that I know of, and if I haven't, can we do that? And it'll totally, in my experience, totally change the relationship with your doctor. And say, oh, this person's actually engaged in their health and they want to leverage my expertise. And they're not here just trying to looking for the annual rubber stamp. You're good to go. Keep doing what you've been doing.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example there, and you're so right. My brother has always been much leaner than me, much better built than me in terms of lifting weights and putting on more muscle mass. My little brother always.
I bet he's not as good looking though.
No, he's not. I got more hair than him too. He'd probably kill me for saying that. But he's always, a little bit better than me in sports and things like that. And so he's always been very health conscious from the workout perspective. Okay. And when he was in his 20s, he was very lean, benching more than his weight, 140 pound guy, really lean, 5'8", and, 6-pack abs. And my triglycerides went up, and I did it for screening purposes because of a family history of coronary disease. And I'm like, wow, I got high triglycerides. And, people ignore high triglycerides, and people with high triglycerides often have more atherogenic LDL, low HDL, the protection cholesterol. So I checked my cholesterol. I made an intervention. I got on medication, and I told my brother to check his cholesterol. And he's like, I don't need to check my cholesterol. I'm in way better shape than you. And plus, you're carrying a couple extra pounds. You have a 2-pack. I have a 6-pack. And that's what he told me. And so my dad worked on him, and I said, you're lean and you're mean, but you're eating bagels, you're eating Pop-Tarts, you're eating donuts, and you don't gain an ounce of fat. But what do you look like inside? Okay. So finally my dad held something over his head that, the car's still in his name. I'm going to revoke your car, even though he's out on his own making money. He went and got his cholesterol checked. It was through the roof. Total cholesterol of 300, LDL of like 160. He was blown away. And since that time, he is still lean and mean. His cholesterol is next to normal. He still takes a cholesterol medicine because of family history and the fact it was higher before. Does he still eat an occasional bagel that we give him a hard time about in the carbs? Sure. But he's decreased his fats tremendously. And that's a 20-year intervention that we made in a guy whose father had a coronary stent at 65. So I hope, that I'm there at 65 to see my brother still do well when he's 65. But that's a huge intervention. His primary care doctor didn't check a cholesterol in him. primary care doctor told him to get out of the office. You don't really need to be here. Everything is good. See me in 5 years. Because he was lean and he was mean looking and his blood pressure was normal. And that's been an eye opener to him, and a story that he tells to all his friends who are 40 now that he's in his 40s. Get your cholesterol checked, know your numbers.
Yeah, that's I think a great story and a great example. We assume it's all people who are obese or it happens later in life,
Right.
but the sooner you find out. So he's had to do no medical intervention in essence, right? He just
Right.
kind of, as soon as he knew, he did what anyone would do.
Right.
Like if you're heading for a concrete abutment in your car, you're going to do something different. You're not going
Right.
to keep going.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah. So.
So
Well, that's awesome, but I thank you so much. This was, I
it's a
think,
pleasure, Scott.
a wonderful, wonderful discussion to have with you always, and I think it's even better that we're able to share it today.
Yeah, it's nice to do it together. And I every time we talk, I always say that you teach me so much stuff. As a everyone thinks you're a cardiologist and you know everything. And I always tell people that I'm smart enough to know that I don't know everything, and I'm smart enough to know who the people are that know everything. Hence the referral for one of my patients to you, because I think that's a great story, and I hope people jump on to listen to you and Anthony talk, because that's a phenomenal story. But I appreciate what you do. You're kind of like a one-man team with your podcast. I know your wife's instrumental in what you do, but we don't have the time as cardiologists to do this. And there's a term, health educators. And as you know, you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have a master's degree to be a health educator. And I think we need more health educators, health coaches, life coaches who can take some of the knowledge that you're spreading, because we need the help. A friend of mine, Vic Reddy, is the guy who mans my webpage occasionally and my Facebook, and he keeps telling me, Dr. Hosmane, what are you doing on your social media? Since Vic had to do a couple other projects, we've stagnated. He goes, you need to be on podcasts. You need to record stuff. I'm like, Vic, I don't have the time. And so when I see somebody like you devoting your new career, I really can't call it retirement, but your second career to health and wellness, we need that. So, hats off to you, because we can't spread the word. I mean, we're working 8 to 8 here with the pandemic, and a lot of what we do is secondary prevention. So I hope people will watch this. I hope people will value what you do. I also, and it's something else struck a mind with your consulting business that you do. If I may, you do the consulting business where you help seniors stay in their homes and keep a safe home environment. As we were talking, I'm thinking, maybe we need to add a side business to that as you're rolling into 40 and 50 and you're planning for retirement. Maybe this is something that needs to be added to your business, Scott. A consultation, life coach, health coach. You outlined everything that we need to do, and I think this would be an important adjunct to that, because nobody teaches you this. I mean, and I think you had a podcast before with another physician that I caught wind of, where you were asking her, where was she learning her health and nutrition knowledge? Nobody teaches that, and nobody teaches. They teach you how to plan for retirement if you have a good financial planner, but my financial planner doesn't tell me about my health. So, as we're talking, maybe that's something we can talk offline, or one of your clients or one of the people watching the podcast want to help us with that, because I think that's very important. Every time, like I told you, every time my accountant or financial planner say, "Oh, put money in your health savings account. You can put $7,100 away." I'm like, I want to put something now, preventative. So I think that's something that hopefully somebody out there that's listening to us will jump on that.
Well, you'll appreciate my book when it comes out. It's called Wealth Span, and it really is taking that whole investment philosophy and transitioning over into health. And it's, these are all, any of the things that I talk about, I'm just some dummy that rolled in off the street and wanted to do something different than what he was doing before. But the point is, you don't have to, no one has to go to the depth or the level that I've gone, just because, that's my problem. I don't know when to say stop. But in terms of the basic data, my goal is just bundle it up and make it easy. Right. So someone can take it, and it's like everything. You don't have to learn all at once.
No.
Right? You do these three things this month. next month or the month after you do another 3, and by the time a year goes by, just like savings, you discover there's actually some money in that account, and that I'm going to cash in on later, and it's really no different.
It's baby steps, and you don't have to do everything 100%. But I think if we can save a couple lives, save one life, or prolong one life, or make one life have better quality, I think that it's a win. So hopefully somebody listening out there will be able to make a change.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Hosmane, again.
Thank you, Scott.
You're a wonderful human being, make a great contribution to the community,
Likewise.
but also for educating us all. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Thanks, Scott.